The old estate sat at the end of a gravel road that no GPS could find. That was part of the charm, also the brochure said. Escape the world entirely. No signals, no noise, just you, your love, and Blackthorn Manor. Daniel had booked it 3 months before the wedding. He wanted something unforgettable for their honeymoon, a Victorian manor in the hills of northern England, surrounded by dead oak trees and moorland fog. He'd shown the photos to his new wife, Nora, on their wedding night, and she had pressed her fingers against the screen and whispered, "It looks like a dream." She was wrong. It was not a dream. They arrived on a Sunday evening in late October, when the sky was the color of a bruise and the wind moved through the trees like something breathing. The caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Holt, met them at the iron gate. He had pale, watery eyes and wore a coat that was slightly too large for him, as if he had recently lost a great deal of weight. He said very little. He handed Daniel a heavy brass key and pointed at the front door. "Is the heating on?" Nora asked, pulling her coat tighter. "The manor heats itself," Mr. Holt said. Then he walked away without another word, disappearing into the fog before they could ask what that meant. Inside, Blackthorn Manor was everything the photos had promised. Sweeping staircases, oil portraits in gilded frames, fireplaces taller than a man, rooms that smelled of old wood and candle wax. Daniel carried their bags up to the master bedroom, which had a four-poster bed hung with dark velvet curtains and a window that overlooked the garden below. Nora stood at that window for a long time, watching the trees. "There's something standing between those oaks," she said. Daniel came to look. There was nothing, just the fog and the dark shapes of the trees. "You're tired," he said, and kissed the side of her head. She didn't answer. She kept watching the garden. That night, they ate the cold supper Mr. Holt had left in the kitchen. Bread, cheese, a bottle of wine, and then they went to bed. The manor was very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of the countryside, but a thick, pressing silence, the kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own heartbeat. Daniel fell asleep quickly. Nora lay awake. At some point past midnight, she heard footsteps in the hallway. She told herself it was the manor settling, old timbers shifting in the cold. She lay still and listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the corridor to the other. Then they stopped directly outside their door. Nora did not breathe. A long moment passed. Then the footsteps moved away, down the stairs, and disappeared. She woke Daniel and told him. He checked the hallway, empty, and checked the front door, locked. He came back to bed and held her hand and told her old houses made noise. She knew he believed it. She did not. The next morning was pale and cold. They explored the manor's library, a room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. Daniel pulled volumes at random. Geography, theology, natural history, while Nora moved deeper into the shelves, trailing her fingers along the spines. At the very back of the library, behind a row of encyclopedias, she found a book with no title on the cover. She opened it and found handwriting, a diary, old and cramped and hard to read. The first entry was dated November 1887. A woman named Eleanor wrote about coming to Blackthorn Manor as a bride. She wrote about the beauty of the manor, the kindness of her new husband, and her joy at beginning a new life. Nora smiled at that. It could have been her own diary. She turned pages. The entries grew shorter, darker. Eleanor began writing about sounds at night. Footsteps, voices, a woman's crying that seemed to come from inside the walls. Her husband heard nothing. She began to feel that she was not alone in certain rooms, that something watched her from the corners of doorways. The handwriting became less careful, the letters larger and more desperate. The last entry was dated 3 weeks after the first. It read, "It is not the house that is haunted. It is me. Whatever followed me here from my other life, whatever I thought I had left behind, it has found me. It wears the shape of what I love most. Do not trust what you see in this house. Do not trust what feels familiar. And do not, under any circumstances, follow it into the garden after dark." There were no more entries. Nora closed the book. She sat very still for a moment. Then she put it back where she had found it and did not tell Daniel what she had read. That afternoon, she went alone into the garden. She needed air. She walked the stone paths between the dead flower beds, her hands in her pockets, her breath misting in the cold. The oak trees stood at the far edge of the garden, just as she had seen them from the window. She walked toward them slowly, and then she stopped. There was a figure standing among the trees, a woman in a long pale dress, her back to Nora. Her hair was dark and loose and hung down past her shoulders. She stood very still. Nora's heart hammered. "Hello," she called. The woman turned. It was Nora's face, her own face, looking back at her from across the garden, expressionless, pale as paper. And then the figure turned away and walked deeper into the trees and was gone. Nora ran back to the manor and locked the door behind her. She found Daniel in the sitting room by the fire, reading. She sat beside him and gripped his arm very tightly and said, "I need to tell you something." She told him everything, the diary, the figure, the footsteps the night before. She told him calmly and clearly, the way she had been trained to do in difficult moments, not letting the panic show. When she finished, Daniel was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Nora, I saw you in the garden from the upstairs window. Just you, walking alone. There was no one else." "It was wearing my face," she said. He didn't argue. He was that kind of man. He would not tell her she was wrong, even when he believed it. He just put his arm around her and said they didn't have to stay. They could leave in the morning. Tonight they would stay by the fire together and not go anywhere. She agreed. She was grateful. She should have insisted they leave that very hour. That night, very late, Daniel got up from bed. Nora woke just enough to register the movement, to feel his warmth leave the mattress. "Water," he murmured, and she sank back toward sleep. She woke again at 3 in the morning. He had not returned. She called his name. Silence. She got up and checked the bathroom. Empty. She went into the corridor, and the corridor was dark and cold, colder than it should have been. She called his name again, louder. No answer. She moved through the manor with her phone as a torch, checking room after room. The library, the dining hall, the sitting room. The fire had burned down to almost nothing. The wine glasses from the night before were still on the table. The front door was standing open. The garden beyond was dark, but there was a pale shape at the far end of it, moving between the oak trees. A figure in a white shirt, Daniel's white shirt, moving slowly, steadily, deeper into the trees. "Daniel!" she screamed. The figure paused, turned, raised one hand, slowly, as if beckoning her to follow. Eleanor's words came back to her, clear and cold. "Do not follow it into the garden after dark." Nora grabbed her coat and her keys from the hook by the door. She did not go into the garden. She ran to the car. She drove to the end of the gravel road and stopped, hands shaking on the wheel, and called the emergency services. Then she called Daniel's phone. It rang from the pocket of his jacket, still hanging on the chair by the bed where he had left it. The police came. They searched the manor and the grounds. They found Daniel in the garden, sitting at the base of one of the oak trees, cold and dazed, with no memory of how he had gotten there. No injury, no explanation. He had simply walked out of the manor in his sleep, he said, or they said it for him because it was the most sensible answer available. The police left. Mr. Holt appeared out of nowhere in the grey morning light, as if he had been waiting. He said nothing about what had happened. He simply held out his hand for the key. Daniel and Nora gave it to him and got in the car and drove south and did not stop until they reached the motorway, where the shops were open and the lights were bright and other cars moved around them in the ordinary world. For months afterward, Daniel swore he remembered nothing of that night. But once, much later, when Nora asked him what he had been thinking, what had drawn him out of bed, out of the house, into the dark, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You called me. I heard your voice outside the window. You said you needed me to come." Nora had not called him. She had been asleep in the bed beside him. Whatever had been in that garden knew their names. It knew their voices. It knew exactly what would make each of them move toward it, and it had used those things like tools. That was the most frightening thing. Not the cold, not the dark, not the face she had seen wearing her own features. It was the patience of it, the knowledge of it, the way it had studied them from the moment they arrived and learned precisely how to call them. They never spoke of Blackthorn Manor publicly. There was no story to tell that anyone would believe, and besides, the memory had a quality that resisted language, like trying to describe a smell, or the feeling of falling just before you wake. But Nora returned the diary. She mailed it back to the address on the brochure, wrapped in brown paper with no note. She needed it out of the house. 3 days later, it arrived back in the post. No return address, no explanation. She burned it in the backyard on a grey November afternoon and watched the old pages curl and blacken, and did not look at what shapes the smoke made as it rose. Some doors, once opened, do not simply close again. Some places choose their guests as carefully as guests choose them. And love, real love, the kind that makes you get up in the dark to find someone, the kind that makes you follow a familiar voice without question, is perhaps the oldest vulnerability there is. Blackthorn Manor knew that. It had known it for a very long time.